everybody, this video is a review of the concept of validity for Baruch's Philosophy 1600 Logic and Moral Reasoning. So, validity means that the premises entail the conclusion. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. It is never the case that the conclusion could be false while all the premises are true. If a premise is false, the conclusion might well be false also. The first three bullet points on this slide are really just different ways of saying the same thing, the definition of validity. Validity only applies to deductive arguments. You would never want to say that an inductive or a practical argument is valid or not. It's evaluated in the form of a conditional, and even one counterexample proves an argument's invalidity. So, the relationship of validity and deductive arguments. Deductive arguments, remember, do not need to reference the real world. They're evaluated solely on the connections between the premises. They result in absolute certainty. So if a deductive argument is valid, then if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true, with no exceptions or possible exceptions. If there is even one exception, the argument is not valid. Because you don't need to rely on the real world to evaluate whether a deductive argument is valid, this kind of logic is good for computer programming and fiction, where you're making your own world, and hypotheticals, where you're planning for futures in this world that haven't happened yet. It's good for plenty of other things as well, but we'll see examples from these three kinds. Starting here. Premise 1. If I input the homework due time for 6:30 a.m. on the Baruch Logic website, it will actually be due at 2:30 a.m. that same day. Premise 2. I do input the homework due time for 6:30 a.m. on the Baruch Logic website. Conclusion? Therefore, it will actually be due at 2:30 a.m. that same day. This is a valid argument, and it just so happens to be sound, because this is the way the Baruch Logic website is right now, and it's what time I actually set things for. Here's another example. All websites I code use only green text. I code the Baruch Logic website. Therefore, the Baruch Logic website uses only green text. This is another valid argument, but it's not sound. As it turns out, both premises are false, because I don't code any websites using green text or non-green text, and I certainly don't code the Baruch Logic website. Here's an argument from fiction. All stormtroopers, yes, from Star Wars, have white armor. Premise 2. FN2187 is a stormtrooper. So, FN2187 has white armor. If we take both of those two premises on faith, we know that the conclusion is true. And that works out even if you've never seen Star Wars. So this is valid. Is it sound? It's no reference to the real world. We're going to go ahead and leave aside the question of whether or not you can speak of things as true or false when they have to do with fictions. That's a different question altogether. You may want to take an aesthetics class or a philosophy of literature class. Here's another one from a hypothetical. If it rains tomorrow, the game will be canceled. Premise 2. If the game is canceled, we won't watch it on TV. Conclusion. If it rains tomorrow, we won't watch the game on TV. So this is valid, but is it sound? That future hasn't happened yet. And perhaps also, the soundness of this really depends on whether or not the people planning the game will really cancel it during the rain. And it also depends on whether or not, I suppose, you might tune into the channel and just hope that the game comes on. Perhaps you're really excited to see it and you want to watch the people taking care of the tarp on the field or something like that. So the soundness depends on whether or not those hypotheticals are really involved in somebody's plans. Alright, validity and the conditional. If the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. We can also write that the same way, with the arrow. Rather, we write it differently, but we would say it the same way. If the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. It's just an if P then Q form. If there's ever a time when the conclusion could be false, while all the premises are true, then the argument is not valid. That, by the way, is going to be important when it comes to learning about the conditional. If even one premise in a valid argument is false, the conclusion might be false. It also may not be, of course. Let's look at the counterexample test. This is a good way to quickly determine whether or not an argument is valid. An argument can work a million times, but if it fails even once, it is not valid. It might be a great inductive argument. Can you imagine a world where all the premises are true, but the conclusion is false? If you can, the argument's invalid. If you can't, either you need to think longer and imagine a little bit more, or the argument is valid after all. Let's put the counterexample test to work. Let's do a little more Star Wars. Premise 1. FN2187 is a stormtrooper. Premise 2. FN2187 has white armor. Conclusion. Therefore, stormtroopers have white armor. If we wanted to construct an inductive argument, we could do this for every number designation of every stormtrooper in all of the Star Wars films. And believe me, there's a lot of them. But this is a deductive argument, not an inductive argument. So instead, we'll just think of a counterexample. Captain Phasma is a stormtrooper, and she does not have white armor. Therefore, this argument is invalid. Both of those premises might be true, but they don't entail that conclusion. The conclusion ends up being false at the same time as the premises are true, and that is an invalid argument. Let's put the counterexample test to work again. All Martians are green. Marvin is a Martian, so Marvin is green. Well, there's no possible counterexample to this. If those premises are true, we're stuck with the conclusion. All X are Y, Z is an X, therefore Z is Y. That kind of argument format is always going to work. However, premise 1 is false, and so is the conclusion. After all, there's Marvin the Martian right there. We can see he's wearing green, but that's not the same as being green, after all, at least not usually. So this argument may be valid, but in the Looney Tunes world, it's not sound. Whether or not it's sound in our world, I guess is a different question entirely. Again, depends on what you think about fictions. Alright, one last counterexample test. If it rains tomorrow, the game will be cancelled. If the game is cancelled, we will not watch it on TV tomorrow. So, if it rains tomorrow, we will not watch it on TV tomorrow. There's no possible counterexample to this, unless you're willing to get really quite strange with your expectations and with your definitions of what it means to watch the game. So how could you watch a game on TV that has never happened in the past, so it's not a rerun, and it isn't happening now, so it's not live? I think this is a valid argument, and I think it's going to always be a valid argument. Whether or not it's sound, though, again, depends on whether this game would really be cancelled on account of rain. If it's a soccer match, after all, or an American football game, it's probably not going to get cancelled. Certainly not if it's basketball. But if it's baseball, then it's definitely getting cancelled if it rains hard enough. Just depends. Alright, I hope this clears some things up about validity, and at least gives you the chance to see how the counterexample test works and how to employ it. Remember, we're going to need validity for the rest of this semester, so I encourage you to not only have watched this video, but also to look back and review the other chapters, the other materials we've got, including the book chapter and the main lecture on validity, just so that you've got all this stuff straight in your head. Alright, thanks for watching.